This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
There are objects which seem to have come loose, either from their place in historical chronology or from their situation in the present and the now. These objects are achronic, and they are disturbing because they disrupt our expectations and because they can alter our own ideas about where and when we ourselves are located in the meshwork of temporality. Achronic objects are involved in the production and are indeed perhaps created into extreme psychological experiences. These are the sublime and the uncanny, and whilst they might both appear emotionally poles apart, both are underscored with this sense of temporal alterity. To examine the ways in which these erratic effects arise and to analyse and question their natures and results in the context of the museum, I will be referring to some aspects of literature and literary theory and literary creations, so ideas about the chronotope, notions from prosody and metrics in poetry. But I will also be grounding my discussion very thoroughly within the space of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is in Oxford. It's a controversial and dichotomous institution, able to provoke both wonder and revulsion in its visitors. I don't know if anybody's been there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. So I have to put my kind of heart on my sleeve now, that's how I like it. Founded in 1884, it has retained a great deal of its Victorian style. Whilst it was intended as a museum to display order and progress by its founder, which I feel had rather sinister undertones, its dramatic vistas and dark corners mean that it is the perfect site to illustrate the museological sublime and the museological uncanny. The sublime is incalculable, denies boundaries. The sublime is immensity, vastness. The sublime is grandeur, that which provokes astonishment. The sublime is terrifying and abyssal. The sublime can appeal to our aesthetic senses, but it can also horrify them, be repugnant. The sublime will force us to submit to its power. Perhaps it comes closest to the idea of wonder, as articulated in Stephen Greenblatt's essay Resonance and Wonder. Here, he speaks of wonder as the power of the displayed object to stop the viewer in his or her tracks, to convey an arresting sense of uniqueness, to evoke an exalted, like the sublime. The sublime is paradoxical, and since the time of this chap, Longinus, if not before, people have attempted to define and ontologically locate its source. But the sublime appears to be definable only by what it is not. And precisely whence it arises, the viewer's mind, the object itself, the environment, is much debated and perhaps always multiple and mutable. In a museum, perhaps the sublime occurs when some experience, be it object, language or vista, pulls its subject out of the already unusual chronotope of the museum space, and further still from the mundane everyday, into a moment where temporal process is halted, into a crystalline now. What types of sublime occur in the museum context? Four forms, based upon their qualities and characteristics, might be found in the Pitt Rivers: the rhetorical, the natural, the mathematical, and the dynamical. We will begin, as does our earliest text on the sublime, with the rhetorical. In the 1st century Perihupsos, generally attributed to this chap, Pseudo-Longinus, or Dionysus Longinus, the art of the sublime is brought about by the violence of transportative language, which, as he said, does not appeal to reason, but instead confounds judgment and sways every reader whether he will or no. There are many places within a museum where such language could arise, on the wall texts, on the labels for objects, on the case titles, in paratextual documents. And yet in the Pitt Rivers, which is visually so bombastic, it does not appear. Instead, the labels and texts are factual, and many of them are tiny. Really funny. I love the labels, I really do. They make me so happy. But they're large enough really only for an accession number and maybe a short name. Often quite sort of epigraphic and strange. And though they have their own kind of haiku-like poetics, these labels cannot in themselves be said to be sublime. And yet perhaps they enhance the effect of the object itself. Longinus noted that it was easy to over-verbalise, to create bombast in language which puts the words themselves, and that about which they are talking, beyond the sublime, to make them puerile and ridiculous. Perhaps the less we know about these things, the more enchanting they become. The rhetoric of the sublime is a violent one. It has been suggested that sublime language ravishes its reader or listener. They're given no choice in falling under its spell, and it is not their reason that is appealed to. The sublime, therefore, can persuade the reader even if it is false. In a museum, a house which claims to be or is given the moniker of a bastion of knowledge, overt rhetorical language like this would not be widespread, would it? In the Pit Rivers in particular, which is already filled with controversial objects, such as shrunken heads acquired under dubious circumstances, which I'm not going to show you because I don't really think it's appropriate. Such language would not only produce this ravishment of its reader, but also a kind of imperialist discourse, claiming the objects as things to be toyed with in the English tongue of the 21st century, and the sublime is, after all, a language of dominion. In the course of the 18th century, nature would take centre stage as the provocateur of the sublime. This is perhaps the kind of sublime most commonly encountered in the space of the art gallery. Here is Der Wanderer über dem Nebelmeer, painted by Caspar David Friedrich in 1818, the iconic figure of German romanticism. In the natural sublime, it is the environment which produces the awe and the wonder. This kind of sublime can be seen in many museums, particularly the Pit Rivers actually, despite the fact that it's a man-made environment. The drama begins with the door. The sublime experience can be enhanced by delay and the consequent ramping up of expectation. I don't know if any of you have been there when the Pit Rivers actually opens. They wander around with a bell and chime. The Pit Rivers Museum is now open. It's quite fun. I enjoy it a lot. The door to the Pit Rivers is at the back of the University's Natural History Museum, and it's arched in neo-Gothic, evocative of a lost romantic world. When it is opened, the visitor is propelled through from the light bright Natural History Museum to the darkness beyond. Stretching out into this darkness is an astonishing vista, the aptly named Great Court, filled with case after case and surmounted at its end with the huge Hyder totem pole. It was actually put in one piece as well. It's been in the same position for years. In a Kantian sense, the types of sublime encountered here are both mathematical and dynamic. The mathematical sublime is one of magnitude, the appearance of infinity, the lack of perceptible boundaries. It is unclear how many objects there are in the Great Court, or where or what they even are. The cases seem innumerable, the hidden objects, some of which are below the level of the cases, only children can see them taught. Even more so. This sense of the boundless is enhanced by the architecture. The Pit Rivers stretches upwards towards things we cannot yet see from our point of the entrance, and it stretches outwards into a darkness where the walls, the limits of the museum, are obscured. The dynamic sublime is, for Kant, something built on power and fear. It compels the mind like the shock of the ictic, the stressed beats in poetry, or like emphatic punctuation in a text. It has a sudden power. The Hyder totem pole has just such this power. Oversized, well-positioned, brightly coloured and lit, the totem draws our attention from the moment we enter the museum. Its impact, its awful qualities, stem from its inherent dynamic weight. There are many potential origins for this experience of the sublime: objects, environmental contexts, the viewing mind. Attempting to locate the sublime's origin point was the focus of the 18th century discourse on the matter. It is certainly the case that the inherent qualities of an object can contribute to its sublimity, its wonder. Its size and dramatic appearance definitely permit the conceptual ascension of the Hyder totem. However, There were those, like Kant and Shaftesbury, who took a cognitive stance on the production of the sublime, locating it in the mind of the apprehending subject and its own ability to transcend corporeality. But I don't think the Heider totem is effective, at least not immediately, through extensive cognitive processing and thoughtful analysis, but through its visceral embodiment. I suspect that the mind has a more individual role in resonance, the Greenblattian form of object characteristic which reaches out to the world and evokes in its viewer memories, feelings and emotions for something beyond itself. For Coleridge, the sublime was rendered intelligible through the reality in which it was contained. The environment has power over the object. The totem stands out against its dark background, spotlit at the end of the great chord. The arrangements and stylings of the museum space are a kind of language, a kind of rhetoric, figures, rhythms and narrative devices which are deployed to enhance the effect of objects. Longinus himself noted how the sublime is created through these conditions, and in Desire and Language, Julia Christopher discusses how poetic language, intonation and rhythm are productive of jouissance and sublimity. John Dennis believed that the sublime could arise only in interaction. It is neither the property of the mind, nor of the object, nor of the environment, but built in the relationship between all of these things. The sublime, I feel, is emergent and cannot always be predicted. A museum maker can expect the Heider totem pole to produce a moment of sublimity, but it may not. And there are things which, because of the crucial role played by the viewer, may be made unexpectedly but utterly sublime. Central to Kant's morality of the sublime was an abstracted notion of truth, and acting in the name of this truth can lead to behaviour generally seen as immoral. Abraham's attempted murder of Isaac in the name of the truth of the word, a case in point. For the sake of encountering the sublime, we might become indifferent to the things of this world. In the museum, perhaps we ignore the debatable cultural morality which brought us the Heider totem in the first place, muffling it with the sublime image it presents. Perhaps we also ignore or find less important the other objects in the museum, even those which are resonant but plain. There is also an underlying and important discourse to do with power in the sublime. We've discussed how the sublime prevents its victim from exercising rational choice. In the museum, this violation might play out thus. In a recent book called Museum Making, Narratives, Architectures, Exhibitions, the architect Lee Skolnick professed a desire to create epiphany. Whilst the sublime in a postmodern sense acknowledges that we must fail to connect to a higher reality through the experience, epiphany has historically meant the manifestation of God, the revelation of divine eternal truths. The attempt to produce epiphany then presupposes the kinds of truths that these are, and it also denies the role of social and mental differences and the active stances of the viewers encountering the sublime. But the sublime, because it does not accord to preconceived social ideals of beauty, can be avant-garde, rebellious, and even revolutionary. Beauty seeks for singularity and wholeness. The sublime recognises that this cannot always be, and that to accept those singularities is to limit your worldview. Whilst the beautiful does not reveal how it works, the sublime can break its own illusion. It is abyssal. It thereby can show the failings in the status quo, be it political or social. Nobody can trust the sublime. The uncanny turns the most innocuous thing into an object of terror. The uncanny makes boundaries uncertain. The uncanny provokes disquiet, a kind of domesticated horror. The uncanny makes us uncertain about our locations, temporalities, and ourselves. A child of the Burkean sublime, the uncanny sits on the edges of things. It sits at the edges of definitions too. As cognitively disruptive as the sublime, but usually without its grandeur, its precise nature and origins have often been subtly debated. Freud has perhaps the most famous essay on the subject, but his definition, as Hélène Cixous and others have noted, is circular and self-justifying, limited by his psychoanalytic focus on sexual complexes and fear of castration. Ernest Jentsch provided a more successful definition in my mind, which, despite being somewhat broad, captures the concept more clearly. Uncertainty, sensorial or intellectual deprivation, the undermining of human mastery, are all conditions in which the unknowing anxiety, which is the unheimlich, can arise. In a museum, perhaps we can suggest that the uncanny occurs when an object we thought we knew is altered, mutated, taken out of context. The uncanny experience is one where temporal and personal comfort come unstuck, when we no longer know the who, what, where, or when of some aspect of our environmental now. Three forms of disjuncture and discomfort have the potential to arise in the precarious space of the Pitt Rivers Museum: the physical and environmental, the intellectual, and the personal. The spatial and objectual encounters a visitor makes in a museum can conspire to produce a sense of not quite at homeness. Space can be shaped to make humans feel very uncomfortable. Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin, with fragmented galleries interspersed with voids, leaves its visitors estranged, somewhat destroys their role as spectators, and leaves the history of Jewish persecution unredeemed. In the Pitt Rivers, we are left in a darkened space, deprived of something of their sensory ability and hence their ability to fully cognise the space and where things are. The visitor is left unsure, and even the nature of what they are surrounded by is unclear. The darkness and reflections block things, and there are objects hidden in the bases of cases which not all visitors will be able to see. Sounds come from places hidden to vision. This is also a semiotically uncanny space. Its chronotopic connotations are those of Victorian ethnography and the imperialism and violence which lay behind it. There are those who are uncomfortable with this environment because they believe it to evidence backwardness in the policy and approach of the museum. But perhaps the discomfort is of a more traditionally uncanny sort. Following Schelling, Freud suggested that the uncanny was that which should have remained hidden, having come to light. In the Pitt Rivers, unlike in many other anthropology museums, the ghosts of the sad and sometimes brutal past of that discipline are not erased, but come back to us through architecture and decor which has not been modified to seem neutral and understated, as well as the objects and photographs on display. I mean, I find a lot of these photographs quite uncomfortable. In the Pitt Rivers, though, we become very visibly guilty. The home, the disciplines we've built are built on trauma and violence, and we're not allowed to forget that. For in this museum, the visitor encounters things which are not just exotic and which have a kind of unfamiliar sublimity. Next to these objects are things that we vaguely recognise as our own: knives, Welsh candle holders, lace cushions and bobbins that some of us still recognise from our family, or objects that we are told once belonged and still sometimes belong to our culture, as well as that of others, such as tarot cards. The Pitt Rivers' intent is not to create or exacerbate difference and otherness, but to trace similarities. The distinction between ourselves and others, individually and culturally, is made less clear. Familiarity becomes unhinged. The boundaries between objects we think we know and objects we think we do not are blurred. Central to Jentsch's uncanny is doubt about the animate or inanimate nature of things and people. Olympia, the doll in Hoffman's tale The Sandman, is his archetypal figure of ambiguity, as it is for Freud. The Sandman is an archetypal figure of the uncanny for Freud, but very different. The Pitt Rivers contains many objects which produce this zoetic uncertainty. There are two basic forms. The first sort are objects which were once alive. These attract attention at least partially because they are gruesome. This is the mummified corpse of Gertrude, a woman from Western Thebes who died aged not yet 30, nearly 3,000 years ago. We also have the shrunken heads, of course, and not all of these are human, but they cause a thrill of horror through their altered yet recognisably anthropomorphic form. Secondly, though, and perhaps more prevalent, are objects which have never been alive, but which through their arrangements or design are made to imitate the living. The further away from reality they are, the less uncanny they are. As Jentsch said, the most absolute and complete imitation of nature and living beings, different in only small imperceptible details, is most able to produce the uncanny. So these Noah masks from Japan which are highly stylised and which are in any case only faces. They're creepy because they seem to watch, don't really like having them behind me, and because they are still. But they are only partial and can pose no threat. However, on the upper gallery, in the corner opposite the entrance door, are two mannequins dressed as samurai warriors. One stands and one sits. In the dark, arranged so naturally, but their faces shadowed, it seems possible that they might get up and move, and that they might act with violence to protect their charges. They watch over the weapons gallery like sentinels, and this gallery is itself full of objects which were used to remove life, displayed as beautiful things with their violence elided. Homi K. Bhabha wrote that the act of ethnography, the writing of cultures, involves a disturbance of sorts, a split in identity. The ethnographer is always in a position of diegetic ambiguity, at once the subject and the object of their work, writing of others, but also writing themselves. Who is on display in the Pit Rivers? Not just the cultures and people named on the labels, not just the Haida, the Nuer, the Benin. It is those who built the museum and those who are looking at and experiencing it today. There is an agitation in the sense of self and personhood, a kind of doubling here. The Pit Rivers, with its system of cultural interlinkages, the reflections on the cases, and how we can look back onto where we have been, shows us the us in others, and turns its visitor into an object of observation to themselves and to others. Yet there is another double here. The direct figure of the uncanny, wrote Hélène Cixous, is the ghost. In the museum, when we see people in photographs, when we see objects we have used, we see the future spectre of our own mortality. The uncanny is homelessness, exile from what we thought domestic and comfortable. In the Pit Rivers, not only are we estranged from the everyday by the designed and emotive space of the museum, we are also estranged from a singular conception of the world, historical and contemporary, and still further from an idealised version of Western history. The Pit Rivers is uncanny because it does not allow us to be domestic in our past. It refuses to allow us as individuals to redeem or forget about the spectre of colonialism which haunts our present. Like the sublime, the uncanny has apparently many potential points of origin: objects, the environment, the conscious inhabitant. While certain objects are discomforting, they are only really so out of situ, and it is through encounter that we make them so. Their strangeness is also partly a product of the environment. Already destabilised by the darkness and unfamiliar objects, the visitor to the Pit Rivers is able to find even the most mundane and normal artefact disturbing. But because the uncanny is at heart to do with displacement, it is perhaps a far more obviously emergent and relational thing than its grander cousin. Yet even to ask where to locate the origin of the uncanny is to an extent to misunderstand it. By its very nature, it is permanently displaced and orphan, always interstitial. To pin it down is to give it its own antithesis, a home, and thereby to negate it. Haunting is not docile, said Derrida, nor does it belong to time. We have spoken above, briefly, of redemption. This word is derived from that meaning deliverance from sin, or the buying back of time or goods. T.S. Eliot wrote that all time is unredeemable. I take this to mean that we can't buy back and return to not history the sins of the past, and we can't gain atonement from and for people now dead. We who were not there can only remember, and the ghosts of colonialism in the Pit Rivers have a role to play in making sure that that memorialisation occurs. Jentsch said that the human quest for intellectual mastery is undermined in the uncanny. There is in the Pit Rivers no longer a singular history, no longer a singular idea of culture, and no one, not the space, its objects, its makers, or its visitors, is quite in control. Central power is destabilised, balance equalised. Derrida wrote that meanings don't so much inhabit objects as haunt them. For each object, therefore, there are potentially multiplicitous meanings. The uncanny figures of the double as the object's other, and the ghost, the spectre, open the way to a more culturally and historically plural reading of material culture. Heterogeneity opens things up, said Derrida. It lets itself be opened up by the very effraction of that which unfurls, comes, and remains to come, singularly, from the other. So perhaps the uncanny is a way of coming to terms with plurality in the present, past and future, a way of showing, like the sublime, where the cracks in the status quo lie, a way to move towards the politics of the future. The uncanny and the sublime should not be used without due consideration. They are highly emotive and philosophically difficult phenomena. I said in my abstract that the conclusion would raise the difficult issue of provocation. Can, and more importantly should, those who display material culture deliberately endeavour to create either of these states and visitors to their exhibitions? What are the consequences of their use for museums? Having heard what I have to say on the matter, I'd like you to think about that, and maybe afterwards you can respond.